Mr. Sunak, you've provided a statement to this module of the inquiry, and I'm going to give the reference number now for the record, which is INQ 000661483, and you've provided that statement in your capacity as Chancellor of the Exchequer during the pandemic, having been appointed, as the inquiry understands it, on the 13th of February of 2020.
Yes, that is right. And good morning, Mr. Wright. Good morning, Milady. Thank you for the opportunity to provide evidence today. Of course, this is all about making sure that we can be better prepared for any future pandemic, and I look forward to providing evidence in the spirit of constructive candour, as I enjoyed doing last time around. But before we begin, I would like to extend my condolences to all those families who lost their loved ones during COVID. Remembering those we lost and all those who suffered should, of course, be the starting point for all these discussions. And before we move on to the detailed questions, Mr. Wright, if I may, I'd like to put on record my thanks and my deep gratitude to the teams at the Treasury, HMRC, and indeed all the departments that work to devise and then deliver all the economic support programmes that were put in place. They worked tirelessly, selflessly, and without complaint. And I think they demonstrated exceptional skill and professionalism throughout. It was, to me, a very fine example of public service, and I felt personally very fortunate to have both their advice and their support during what was an incredibly difficult time for the country.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sunak. On the subject of constructive dialogue and looking ahead, the terms of reference for this inquiry require the inquiry to identify lessons to be learned, to inform preparations for future pandemics across the United Kingdom. And so in each area of questioning, I want to very much focus on your reflections and lessons learned from both what went well, and that's important, and where you think a different approach might be beneficial in a future potential emergency. And over the last 4 weeks, the inquiry has heard a lot of evidence about what has happened during the economic response and received a lot of statements addressing that in detail. And so I don't just want to ask you questions about what could or should be done next time, if there is a next time, but how, from a practical perspective, that might be achieved. Bearing in mind it's easy to say, well, you could do this or do that, but the real question is, how do you actually make that happen? Can I, to assist you, Mr. Sunak, and those following your evidence, just set out the basic structure that I'm going to follow in my questioning, so you know the order in which we're going to deal with the subjects, and we will work through these in the course of the 6 sessions of evidence that we have with you. So first, I'm going to examine preparedness as part of the initial response, look at the scale and nature of the shock, the economic shock that the country was facing, then look at some systemic and structural issues in terms of decision-making and delivery. I'd then like to move on to funding, and in particular funding for the devolved administrations, and then to explore the policy response, looking at, in particular, the coronavirus job retention scheme, first of all, then the self-employed income support scheme, then Kickstart, then the uplifts to both universal credit and working tax credit, then the uplifts to both universal credit and working tax credit, then examining the statutory sick pay rebate scheme, then looking at loans as an umbrella heading, picking up different loan schemes within that, grants as an umbrella heading, picking up different elements of grant schemes. And then I'd like to ask you some questions, Mr. Sunak, about access by the voluntary community and social enterprise. Then to examine the economic impact of long COVID as a discrete subject. And then finally, and I'm sure you'll be relieved that it's a finally, to come to giving you an opportunity and to discuss any overarching lessons and reflections that you have, having been Chancellor during this emergency, and to look at any recommendations or thoughts for the future that you wanted to share with the inquiry. We obviously will pick up reflections as we move through, but I want to give you, as I have with every witness, an opportunity at the end of your evidence to make any points that you feel are important points of learning. As I've said, you were appointed on the 13th of February of 2020 as Chancellor. You'd previously been Chief Secretary to the Treasury, so you had been within the Treasury, is that right, before that?
Yes, that is right.
And there had been a number of appointments on or about that date. We've heard Lord Sharma was also appointed on the 13th of February. And we know that the current Governor of the Bank of England came into post a month later, 16th of March. And we understand that the budget, but that is a regular fiscal event, as opposed to some emergency budget, was programmed for the 11th of March. So regardless of the pandemic, your first job was going to be, or your first big job was going to be to deliver that budget on the 11th of March. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. And so you had been, and I'm just setting this context really to remind us all of the scale of the challenge that you and officials at the Treasury were facing at the time. You had been Chancellor for just over a month when, on the 16th of March, the Prime Minister recommended avoiding all non-essential contact and travel. And then a week later, there was an announcement of lockdown that effectively put the economy into something approaching hibernation. And this was therefore a significant economic crisis unfolding that was unprecedented. You informed the nation on the 17th of March in a speech that the coronavirus pandemic is a public health emergency, but it is also an economic emergency. And you put it, Mr. Sunak, in this way: we have never in peacetime faced an economic fight like this one. And it was an economic fight that resulted, the inquiry knows, in fiscal interventions to a value of in excess of £350 billion over the course of the pandemic. So I've just set that context so we remind ourselves of where we were in February and March of 2020. From your perspective, coming new into the job, for example, you were having to react to a situation for which there was no playbook, as it were. Nothing like this had happened before. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I mean, you mentioned I'd been in the Treasury. I'd been appointed Chief Secretary to the Treasury the previous July, so not a huge amount of time in that context. I was obviously very new to senior government, and then it was a surprise to be made Chancellor in the middle of February. And at that point, I inherited a budget date which had been previously set, that the government had announced and was being worked towards. So my immediate job was to, put together a budget in the space of a few weeks, which in ordinary course I think would probably be what you would imagine to be the most difficult job you'd ever have to do as Chancellor. As it turned out, that was really one of the easier things I had to do, given what then unfolded over the next few days, weeks, months. And at that moment, things were moving very quickly. So even during the budget preparations, it was clear that what was happening with the pandemic was escalating. And so I wouldn't say we necessarily rewrote the budget, but as well as the regular budget that we had planned, what we then ended up having to do midway through that prep was to deliver a set of COVID-specific responses in that budget, which I'm sure we can go through. So the budget itself was almost a budget that delivered largely what was in the 2019 manifesto from an economic perspective, but then also had a set of interventions specifically designed to deal with the pandemic as we imagined it would be at that moment. Obviously, we had to build on those pretty considerably and quickly thereafter. So all that is to say, already the budget contained some things, and then we iterated very quickly thereafter. And to your point, there wasn't a toolkit. No. There was not a playbook that you could pull off the shelf that said, well, this is how you tend to deal with pandemics in the same way that you somewhat have with other economic shocks or financial shocks. So you did have to draw on some things that we had done in the past, and we'll get into that with the specific interventions, but largely listen to the health and medical advice as to what was likely to happen, and then do the best you could at designing economic interventions which would help support the country through that period.
Yeah, I mean, these may not be the words you'd use to describe it, but we heard from Sir Charles Roxburgh, who kept a diary, and caveating that in that it was a personal diary that he shared with the inquiry. The way he put it in an entry on the 17th of March was, from his perspective as one of your senior officials looking at what you had to do, he wrote down that you were in a position of having to pull a rabbit out of a hat, is effectively how he was looking at things in terms of the situation in which you found yourself. And really building on that, a lot of the schemes, and we're talking here about fundamental, significant schemes like the coronavirus job retention scheme, as you said, there was no playbook. You were having to devise those at speed. We heard from Dr. Leunig, an advisor, about 55 hours of time to conceptualise and announce the furlough scheme as it became known. And what sort of pressure did that place you and your officials under in terms of the need to deliver at speed?
I think taking a step back, and maybe actually slightly going back to your previous question, I think there was just an enormous amount of uncertainty. I think that was the number one challenge. We were dealing with something that no one had dealt with before, and there was uncertainty about the scale, the potential duration, the behavioural response, and the wider macroeconomic impact of all of this, both from the MPIs and then how the economy would respond. And that's what made it so tricky in terms of figuring out what to do. And as then you just said, I think speed was paramount, because one thing that was crystal clear that this was happening very quickly and was about to have an extraordinary impact very fast on millions of people, their livelihoods, and millions of businesses as well. So not only are you trying to do things that have never been done before, you have to do them as fast as you humanly can, and that's why at the opening of my evidence I did want to put on record my thanks, because I felt I was new to the job, I was new to being in cabinet, having a job like this, and then having obviously to deal with something like this and do the best job you could for the country. Having the support, the advice of people around you who were working incredibly hard at particularly those first few weeks, was something that will stay with me for the rest of my professional life. It was an extraordinary effort by a whole number of people, trying to serve the country in the best way they thought they could. And maybe if it's helpful, I can talk a little bit about what we were trying to solve for. So when we were sitting there in these meetings, and you probably heard a little bit about this from Charles's evidence, our understanding of what the virus would do, or the impact it would have on the economy, what we did know is what we were trying to prevent, and that was what we call economic scarring. We knew that there was going to be an economic shock. Our understanding was that it would be temporary. I think our understanding at the beginning was that it would last several weeks to a few months. And what we were focused on doing is making sure that the temporary shock did not have long-term serious economic consequences, and that's what the term economic scarring means. And there are various transmission mechanisms for economic scarring: damage to aggregate labour supply, damage to the capital stock, damage to what we call total factor productivity, which is how you knit things together and create things out of them. And so, that was what we were trying to do, and I think that was the right set of objectives. And then you talked about the how, and earlier on, that then led to a few things that we were designing schemes and designing economic policy to deliver in terms of outcomes that we could be measured against. And the first was to prevent unemployment and protect living standards.
I don't want to cut you off, but I am going to come on to those priorities shortly. I just, at the moment, if we could, and if I don't keep this promise, you can haul me up about it, but we will come on to that very soon. Just before we get there, just going back to this point about speed and there being no playbook, you referred to that. In ordinary times, if we're talking about governance in ordinary steady state, things like the CGRS, schemes like that, would have taken months to work up, to consult upon, to implement in ordinary government proceedings. How important was it, did you think? Yes, there was no playbook, so you couldn't dust it off and say, what do we do in this situation? But did you find that actually having an entrepreneurial approach to decision-making was a benefit? In other words, that being freed of the usual strictures of government systems and operations?
I don't think it necessarily was strictures, but I think the necessity of speed just meant that everyone recognised we didn't have the luxury of time.
Yeah.
And I think that was everyone's driving force, really. I can't think that there were particular processes or structures that somehow we did away with. It was just that we had to work quickly. And as we'll get into later, I think there was an acknowledgement from the beginning. I mean, use the word entrepreneurial. I'd probably say iterative, maybe the other way to characterise it. There was an acknowledgement early on when I was talking to the team that, of course, we weren't going to get everything right straight away. I think that would have been, surprising given the speed at which we were operating and the scale of the interventions we were designing and putting in place. So there was a recognition up front, and I encouraged the team to be comfortable with that was okay, right? We couldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good, and we were going to have to acknowledge that we would iterate as we go. I think there are general lessons for policy making, I think, in any case, about that, what they call in the Cabinet Office a test and learn approach and an iterative approach to policy making. I think that's a good thing. I think that's what you see in the private sector for sure. I, in general, think that is a good thing for government to try and adopt, even in peacetime. It requires a recognition on everyone's part that you are then putting things out there that are not perfect day one and then iterating them over time. But I think in the context of a pandemic, everyone was comfortable with that, or should have been, because we had to get things out fast. Otherwise, the consequences would have been severely negative.
So that iterative approach has benefits in all times, in your view. And so when we look at playbooks and the idea of playbooks, and this is just why I'm interested in this issue, in terms of how much planning you can ever do. You don't want to plan to the point where you lose the ability to be agile and to react to what's going on. In other words, that you just follow line 1, line 2, line 3. You've got to still be reactive.
Yeah, and I've followed some of the evidence that you've had during this module, and I think this is a really interesting question. To what extent should we come out of this saying, here's a playbook for next time? And I probably, and again, we'll get into it in detail when we go through the individual interventions, my overarching reflection would be we have learnt an enormous amount having been through this once, and we have a set of tools that we developed, we iterated, and no doubt can be improved in the future. But I would slightly guard against the idea that whatever happens next time, you can pull something off the shelf and, as you said, just kind of go, right, line 1, line 2, plug it into a machine and off you go. Each economic shock, each economic crisis is going to be slightly different, and it's important for policymakers at that moment to be agile and responsive to the situation they face, and not be so mechanically thinking, okay, well, just because we did this last time, it's the right thing to do in exactly the same way. So I think you use the word agility. I think that's right. It's just responsiveness to the situation you face, having the agility to respond to it, to be flexible, but also then to acknowledge, even next time, a willingness to be able to iterate as you go, would be my takeaways. Having said that, all of that will be benefited from the fact that we have now developed a whole new set of tools this time around, building on some tools that we had previously, and that will help.
Yeah, we heard some evidence from Dr. Loynig, who his stark evidence was, he was anti-planning, but actually in questioning, I think where he landed was that you can build the architecture now, you can put in place the delivery mechanisms, or you can get the data streams sorted out, you can do that sort of planning, but then you need to also retain agility in terms of reacting to the particular shock. And is that more or less where you...
I would broadly agree with that characterization.
Yeah, okay. So that was... you had to be agile, you had to be iterative, because you didn't have a playbook and there weren't these structures. So that's the starting point. Moving on then to the scale and nature of the shock, and when we've discussed that, then we'll come on to the point you were making about what you were trying to do, what you were thinking about. But in terms of this pandemic, this wasn't a shock, and Andrew Bailey spoke about this, that arose in the economic system or in the global financial markets. This was a health crisis that then had a knock-on effect in terms of an economic shock. Is that right? Yes,
that's right. I think normally when you're responding to an economic shock, part of your job is to try and stimulate economic activity. Here we had the almost reverse situation where the government was deliberately suppressing economic activity. So this is why it was unprecedented, at least for modern policymakers, to have to grapple with and to figure out what the right set of economic interventions would be in that context.
And how important did you consider it to be to really understand in the Treasury the nature of the shock and the extent to which it was a supply-side shock and it was affecting global supply chains, or a demand shock, or the interrelationship between those things?
No, that's exactly what we tried to do, and you'll see it in my evidence and indeed in my evidence in the previous module too. The calls that I had even during those budget preparations with the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, and the Chief Scientific Advisor, separate from the various Cobras and things we were at. I spoke to them specifically with my team to try and glean as much as I could from them in those early days about what this would look like, so we in the Treasury could then do the best job we could of understanding the impact that would have on the economy, how we should think about it, and then help devise the right type of responses. The first iteration of which you saw in the budget, and then we built on thereafter.
Yeah. I mean, ordinarily, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, you set the economic policy direction for the country, and you announce measures in a budget. And so, in a sense, usually the Treasury is in control as much as it can be, or any government department can be. But here, was the Treasury finding it had to be reactive to other events rather than able to control those events, given the nature of the shock?
I think, of course, the Treasury and the economic response had to be responsive to and based on the health interventions. So I think it's kind of a statement of obvious in one sense, but the Treasury couldn't drive the conversation, especially in those early, and nor should it have done, in those early days and weeks. And I went through this in some detail in my evidence in the previous module. My strong recollection of that period is largely the response being led by the Department for Health, together with the medical and scientific advisors, and us largely, following the advice that they were putting in front of ministers and the Prime Minister. And then obviously the economic policy response would be based on that. And as that changed, then we had to change the economic response or anticipate where it might go.
And that's really what I'm coming to, in that we know from all the other evidence the inquiry's heard how rapidly the health position was changing.
Yes.
And so from your perspective, did that mean that the economic position was changing just as rapidly behind the health development?
Yes, that's right. And I think perhaps maybe slightly underappreciated how, and I going back over all those individual meetings of that period, even when I went over it in preparation for the previous module and now, I'm struck by how much that health and medical advice was changing in those early days. I think people, even I was struck by that rereading it. And of course, the economic response then had to keep up with that. And you saw that because we put a set of things in place for the budget, and then very quickly we had to then go and do a whole host of other things. And what we did in the budget wasn't that it was out of date. And in fact, many of those things persisted for a long period throughout the pandemic, but we had to do significantly more than that. And that is a reflection, as you said, of a rapidly evolving health situation.
And that pace and the speed at which things were evolving presumably supports your view about the need to retain agility and to take this iterative approach.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And the Treasury has a great institutional ability to deliver, I'd say, set-piece economic policy announcements because of the budget process. And what we had to do in the organisation, and they responded, absolutely brilliantly to that, and reflect on the time. We almost had to deliver 5 budgets in the space of about 2 weeks. In terms of the scale of what was being announced, they were bigger than pretty much any budget that had ever been announced by any chancellor. And it felt like for a period we were doing one of those every 2 days for that first 2 weeks. It was to go back to what you were saying before, it was an incredibly intense period, those first 2 weeks. And as I said, every second day, I was popping up. It felt like doing a press conference announcing something, and then behind all of that, there was 48 hours of non-stop work to get to that point, and then after that, go and make sure all the implementation was happening, and then move on to the next thing. I think that probably looking back at it, slightly benefited from the fact that there wasn't really time to panic. There wasn't really time to worry. You just, certainly my approach to it individually was you just had to focus on the problem in front of you, run at it, solve it best you could, get on to the next one, and just keep going and not let it consume you. But the organisation, as I said, responded exceptionally well in those early couple of weeks. And probably the other thing to say is, we were all new to working from home at that point, right? I think people forget. I think Charles in his evidence made an observation about that, and it's a small point, but we were not set up with all the things like Teams and everything else. There wasn't, I think, even the right set of plug sockets. I think Charles mentioned in the Chancellor's meeting room in number 11 Downing Street, which is
telephone socket.
That was it.
That's
which
right.
Is why there's we were kind of crowding round the kind of almost sitting room because that was where you could plug in all the various things and have a conference call, and that was what it was like in those first couple of days. So I think, given that, I was very grateful for the team for rising to the challenge to get me what I needed to go out and do what I had to do, which we'll come on to in a second.
And in terms of what the challenge was or became, and again, just for context, we've seen the very first briefing you had as Chancellor about the pandemic, and at that time there was still an expectation it might be contained even in China, that it might not reach the United Kingdom, and then months later the budget, that's all consigned to history. But in February-March, was there still a hope, perhaps even an expectation, that it might be capable of being a relatively short-lived economic shock?
Yeah, you can see that in the evolution of the various minutes coming from the SAGE meetings and the packs that were prepared for ministers in the COBRA meetings. That was very clear. There was a set of things that people were working towards. And I remember clearly at that time, especially in those early conversations, a lot of what the medical and scientific community were advising us was not to go too early, because they were with the various interventions, because they were worried about public, I think, acceptance of them, and they needed to maintain a duration. And so that they were quite focused on getting the timing right. And as the quotes are in my evidence about, I think, the chief scientific advisor at one point saying it's important not to go too early because these things need to be maintained for a period of time. And clearly, as you said, things just kept escalating. Things were put in place. Then ultimately, even at the end, that last few days, I think the Prime Minister said to people it was a voluntary social distancing and to avoid hospitality and leisure on the advice from the scientists. And schools were not closed at first. Then the advice was that they should be closed, and that was followed immediately. And then even at that point, there was a belief that voluntary social distancing, together with school closures, if there was, I think the number was 75% compliance, would be sufficient to manage the virus, to deliver the health outcomes. And then 2-3 days after that was said, it was decided that wasn't going to be achievable, which is why you had to move to a full mandatory lockdown. But to your point, the health and scientific advice was changing every couple of days, and that's what characterised that period. And going back to your point, there was a sense that it could be contained at the beginning, and then it would last for a period of time, more than a couple of weeks, but a period of time. And that's what we initially designed the economic interventions to do.
And that's why I'm really setting this ground, because you're having to be reactive in the Treasury to health events. But as Chancellor, in terms of setting the economic response to the emergency, the economic response to a short-lived emergency may be very different in terms of its policy and implementation to the economic response to a long-lived emergency. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that obviously sounds right. I mean, again, looking back, and I think it's probably better for when we get into the individual interventions. It's not obvious what very significantly large decisions that we would have made that would have been very, very different at the beginning, knowing if you knew that it was going to be for longer than you thought. I mean, there might be some micro design details, but I'm not actually, as we get into it, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. And that's whenever it's appropriate to get into what we were solving for, and then so at least you have an understanding.
Well, let's come on to that now.
Yeah, because I think, as I said, a lot of that is slightly time agnostic in a sense.
No, understood. So here you are. The health position is worsening. That's having an economic effect. What was it you were having to take into account in terms of what you were trying to prevent, what you were trying to achieve, and why?
I mean, I won't repeat what I said about economic scarring, but that essentially is the kind of economic theory underpinning what we were trying to do. And as I said, and just to put it simply, it's to try and make sure that a short-term economic shock doesn't lead to long-term damaging outcomes for the country, the economy, for people and their livelihoods.
Can I just pick up on that?
Yeah.
Does that mean that, so far as it is possible, you want to take interventions that mean that, first of all, the economy can recover quickly and it can recover to the same level or as close to as it was before the emergency?
Yes, it's about protecting that potential output of the economy. And then if you go, and what does that mean? Well, it means preventing mass unemployment, because obviously if you have very large-scale unemployment in the short term, there can be permanent damage from that. So, protecting job matches and keeping people connected to their jobs is important. Linked to that is obviously preventing firm failure. both in and of itself and because of the impact on employment, and protecting, as you described, that potential output of the economy. So otherwise healthy, solvent businesses, you wanted to make sure that they would still be there when this finished, to have the recovery and not lose that output. We always had a strong eye on the most vulnerable. We knew this was going to be an incredibly serious event for the country, and you always want to make sure, I certainly wanted to make sure, and the team knew this, that the most vulnerable in society, that we were making sure that we had an eye on what was happening to them and could support them as appropriate. And then you also wanted to design things that would allow economic activity to recover when appropriate, because long-term economic growth is a function of the efficient allocation of resources in an economy, and what you needed to allow happen at the appropriate moment was for those normal forces to be able to resume. It's not good long-term for an economy, for things to carry on in an artificial state. You believe, as I do, in markets and their ability to allocate resources efficiently. So you wanted to make sure that, as appropriate, economic activity and normal economic allocation mechanisms could operate and markets could function. And then lastly, but not least, of course, was ensuring value for money for the interventions and thereby minimizing the fiscal impact. So as a kind of set of things, there's 4 or 5 things there that were always at the top of our mind. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm sure probably they were written down somewhere, but that was a set of things that we were solving for, fitting in this overarching desire to avoid economic scarring best we could, or minimize it. And as you'll see, as I describe those things, there's an inherent tension between these things. And I mean, all economic policy making is about trade-offs for the most part, but this in particular. And yes, of course, minimizing fiscal impact, ensuring value for money is incredibly important. Designing schemes that could ensure economic activity could resume is, of course, important. Where we probably put more weight in those early days is, as I said, protecting unemployment and business failure. And there's, as we'll go through, there's an inherent tension between these things. And part of my job was to make decisions on where to design policies, which things to weight more or less at any given moment in time. And again, there's not a perfect science to that. That's a judgment, and those are judgments that I made on a regular basis throughout the pandemic. But as to give people, like I said, an overarching sense of what we were aiming for, what our economic objectives were, those were the economic objectives that as they were important to me throughout. Yeah. And maybe one other point I'd make is that those are all the very practical, measurable economic outcomes. I probably underestimated it at the time, but I had a sense of it, but it became clearer over time. I think there's also an incredibly important job for leaders in a situation like this to provide reassurance, and particularly in the sphere of economic policy. I think one of your expert witnesses, Professor Brewer, I thought made an astute comment about that modern economy, modern society depends, I think he said, enormously on confidence. And uncertainty is a dangerous thing, he said. I think in a crisis like this, there was an enormous amount of anxiety, and rightly so. I think people feared for their jobs, their livelihoods, their families, alongside the health anxieties they had. What it would mean for their economic financial security, what it meant for their family's security, what it meant for their house, their small business they'd built up. Were they going to keep their job? Would they have a job to go back to? Would they be able to make their mortgage or rent payments? And so, my role in part was not just to get all the policy things right, which was it was early on to just provide reassurance to the country that we would get through it, that we would do what we could to help people, and as I said, I think that is probably an underappreciated but an important objective certainly from the person in charge of the economic policy response. And I tried to do that early on through the various press conferences and the language I used and the interviews I gave. But I think in the future, can't just get the policy bits right. You do have to be able to just communicate and give people the reassurance at what I think was an incredibly anxious time, as I said, for people and their businesses.
Well, I referenced the speech you made on the 17th of March, I think, at which you publicly made that sort of statement of standing behind people. But can I just pick up on that in terms of reassurance? Because I think it's a point that Andrew Bailey was making in his evidence as governor when he was talking about the bank having an obligation to act. When I was putting to him the narrative of why not just do nothing and sit back and see how things unfolded. And he spoke about the need, I mean, he put it perhaps slightly more starkly than you have, going beyond reassurance to the need to prevent disorder. And he meant that in a social sense, disorder. But I think he was making the point about the need for the people of this country to understand that their central bank, their Chancellor was going to stand behind them economically. Is that what you?
Yeah, I felt that, and said it's probably, we're sitting here five years later, but those early days, those early weeks, it was as I said, it was an incredibly unsettling and time for everybody, and we'll get into as I said later on the individual things, but I think someone who provided evidence in one of your sessions, they were talking about the loans and helping small businesses, but I think actually their comment applies more generally, and they said something to the effect of it felt existential, and I think that is actually a generally good description of the overall situation. Is it felt existential, and that's why I think Andrew's comments, which I haven't seen the precise paragraph that you're referring to, I would agree with. I think said obviously Prime Minister providing overall leadership, but those of us in charge of the economic response, part of our job is that not just to get the policies right, is to give everyone in the country that reassurance and confidence that the people in charge know what they're doing and are going to be able to do their best to help get the country through it. I think that is an important economic policy tool, as well as just the right thing to do from those who have that responsibility to lead at that moment.
Yeah. It's easy to think about government intervention sometimes in terms of how much money people get from the government, depending on their business or their circumstances. But in terms of household incomes and protecting household incomes, would it be fair to say, when you ran through your priorities, that your priority was to protect household incomes insofar as you could through the preservation of business, preservation of jobs, retention of job matching, and in that way?
Yes, I think, and I think in that first press conference or something, I hope always open. It wasn't going to be possible to save every single person's job, and people were going to experience economic hardship as a result of what was happening. And I thought it was important to be honest with people about that up front. There's a balance. You want to provide reassurance, but I think a degree of candour is also appropriate. And once again, my job to get that balance right. I tried to do both things. I think actually, as it turned out, the impact on household incomes and living standards, particularly for the most vulnerable in society, we will get into it in the right section, I assume. So I'll save it for then. But I think the overall results on that were stronger than I would have perhaps anticipated going into this, and I'm very proud of that. I mean, it was something that we had an eye on throughout, and certain policies were designed specifically with that in mind. But when you go back and look at the impact on deprivation or poverty or disposable income for those who are the most vulnerable, as the track record through the pandemic, I think we'll find is much more favourable than anyone might have thought. But more generally, I think the living standards probably come as a consequence, as you said, of protecting people's jobs and that job connection, protecting business failures, etc., etc. But obviously some policies, and universal credit being one in particular, which targeted that as well, and furlough.
Yeah, we heard from again Dr. Loyning about, for example, the approach taken in the United States of America, where this idea, he termed it helicopter money delivered through welfare rather than through job preservation. Though he explained that really that wasn't a policy choice by the US in his view. It was more a fact that they couldn't have delivered the sort of scheme you delivered in terms of job retention because they didn't have the systems by which to deliver it. But it's fair to say, is it, that you put that protection of jobs and recovery of business at the forefront of the response?
Yes, I did, and I did that because I thought that was the best way to, as I said, minimise economic scarring, the long-term damage on the economy, on people's employment security, financial security, and I'm glad when we come onto it, what happened on unemployment was considerably better than anyone had forecasted at the early stages of the pandemic. So we were successful in preventing that mass unemployment, which going in was the biggest fear. The biggest economic fear going into this was there was going to be mass unemployment. And that might speak to what Andrew was perhaps saying about the social disorder. The scale of projections people had about 12% unemployment rates, millions and millions of people without a job. Clearly, that's not something that the country had experienced in a very, very long time, and reasonable to worry about the social impact of that. So, as I said, that was what we're particularly focused on averting. And I think there are different approaches. One thing I'd say is it's probably not that binary, in the sense that it's not either or. We did both. Right? We put support through the welfare system, and we created the furlough scheme to protect jobs and job matches, and we did things to help business, and we created hardship funds for people who might have not benefited from those or needed extra help. So you can do a range of things. I think that's the right thing to do. It's not as binary as, well, it's either this approach or that approach, and I think most countries, when you look at it, adopted a mixed set of tools, and particularly with CJRS, when we get to it, I think most countries ultimately decided that was a sensible intervention, and many other countries did something similar.
And as Chancellor, you were obviously authorising significant public spending. These interventions, we know, cost a lot of money. And you, as you've said, we're trying to stand behind the country, if you like, and business and individuals. But were you also having to factor in that, as Chancellor, you would also have to bring all of this to an end when, hopefully, the country recovered? In other words, this wasn't a blank cheque that could just go on forever. So you were having to bring things in, but also you may go from hero to zero, be the person who had to end it because you had to then start, or the country had to start living within its means, effectively. Yes,
very, very much that was in my head throughout. I mean, I am, by instinct and experience and everything else, a fiscal conservative, right? That is what I believe. I believe in controlled government spending and a lower tax burden as a result of that. And I think lower tax burden comes from control over government spending and borrowing. And so this was obviously atypical in terms of my general view. But I said, I think probably in one of those early interventions, I said, this isn't a time for ideology. I think I might have used that exact phrase or something to that effect in one of those early press conferences. So we had a particular situation that we were confronted with, and that meant, okay, I might in general be someone who believes in a smaller state and a lower tax burden, but this was a unique crisis, and it required a particular response where the government did have to intervene and did have to do these things, which I thought would be in the long-term best interest of the country. And you're absolutely right. Of course, I knew that there's no such thing as a free lunch, and that's why where you could target things more appropriately and effectively, so that you were ensuring better value for money, reducing the fiscal impact, you would try and do those, and that happened throughout. And that's why, I think in the last budget I did actually, no, sorry, not the last budget I did, but the spring 21 budget, I stood up and said, we do now have to pay for these things. I didn't leave the tab in that sense for not to be picked up. I was honest with the country, and now we had to put in place some tax changes, which I, of course, hated doing, to your point, but it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to intervene, and then it was the right thing to make sure that our public finances would then put on a sustainable trajectory there afterwards, which is why I had to, as Chancellor, deliver a tax-raising budget in the spring of 21, precisely because these things are not free and needed to be paid for. Probably, if just to put it in context, in terms of the scale of the support you mentioned, I think it's interesting looking at it. Probably the best way to measure it is as a percentage of GDP. And actually, when you look at the scale of the intervention here, I think the IMF have probably got the best database, which looks at countries consistently. We were very much in the middle of the pack, actually, at about 14% of GDP being the total scale of our response. And you had, countries that were a bit lower than us, so Canada 13%, France and Italy 12 and 13%, and then you had countries that were more than us: Japan 15%, Australia 17%, Germany 18%, and the US 22%. So in terms of the overall scale, we're kind of in the middle of the pack. So some people might say we should have been at the top end. Some people might say we should have been at the bottom end. But for better or worse, we were roughly about average in terms of the overall quantum of the support. And then that splits, because again, I think it's probably underappreciated. In terms of that quantum that you talked about, depending on how you measure it, about 325 billion, give or take, about half of that is what I would call purely economic support. So things like furlough, self-employment scheme, loans, grants, are things that we're probably going to talk most about over the next day and a half. And then about half of the response, or half of that quantum, actually relates to the health response and the broader public services funding. So the funding for the NHS, for PPE, test and trace, vaccines, social care, education, transport, other public services. So it's not precise, but very roughly the way to think about it is we spent broadly on average compared to most advanced countries, and what we spent was about half purely economic response and half the broader public services response. And that's, I think, is just a good framework for people to have in their heads when they think back over what we did.
Well, in fairness, Mr. Sunak, you make a perfectly proper point that this module is looking at the economic response, but there were a lot of other things government was doing in addition to the purely economic response. So,
but as you said, all of which ultimately do have a fiscal impact. And it's not just the economic things that have a fiscal impact, all the interventions on public services to support for the NHS, all those have a fiscal impact too. And in the round, of course, that in the long run, needs to be paid for.
So I hope that fairly sets the context in which all of the decisions we're going to examine were having to be made, not just in terms of the pressure to stand things up quickly and to adapt them rather as you go along, but also in terms of the ultimately hard decision to decide when to withdraw support, so it doesn't either undermine the economic recovery or become support that just can't be funded. So can we move on to looking at systems and structures of decision?
Just before we do, Mr. Wright, maybe I think you've, as I said, summarised the context very well. I think the only thing that we didn't touch on, just to bring to life what that early period was like, was you would have got some of this from Andrew, but I can give it to you from my perspective, was just what was going on in the gilt markets at that time. And if I think back to that period, which you said was intense and filled with anxiety, certainly for me, that was particularly troubling. I mean, I'd been Chancellor for felt like 5 seconds, and then you could see a very material tightening in UK financial conditions, and you had bank the first thing that happened was bank CDS spreads were widening. The CDS spreads are the kind of, think about them as the insurance premium that people can buy to insure against a bank going bankrupt, right, or defaulting on its debt, right? So that's the kind of way to think about it. So that the price for that insurance, these CDS spreads were widening, which is never a great sign. And then you had, I think, on March the 18th, it was the single biggest one-day change in real yields or something since bank independence. So that happened one day, and then the next day there was another move where there looked like there was a bigger move for UK gilt rates than there were for other places, which again is never great. And then you had a failed gilt auction, and that was the first time we'd had a failed gilt auction since the financial crisis. And so one after another, these things were happening, and I think we've all, over the past couple of years, seen the importance of the gilt markets to the health of the UK's economy. Obviously, I come from a financial background, so something I have some familiarity with. But that was acutely stressful. In the context of having to do all these other things, I was sitting there, worried about the UK's ability to fund itself. And in the end, we organised with the Bank of England something called the Ways and Means Facility, which I talked about in my evidence, which thankfully we never needed to use, but essentially as a backstop for the government. If it can't raise the money it needs on the bond markets, it can go to the Bank of England instead for a temporary period of time. And it was last used again in the financial crisis, but it's a pretty exceptional measure. Thankfully, we didn't need it. But I think that was all in my head of all the things that I was kind of worried about, as well as all figuring out furlough over here or loans over there and everything else. That was happening at exactly the same time. And to your point, I'm thinking, gosh, are we going to be able to borrow the money we need to put all these things in place? I need to have that in the back of my head as well, because that really would be a disaster if there was a problem.
No, quite right. You should mention that. I had a little note saying risk to markets, and we skipped over it. But don't worry. Quite properly that you mention it. And as you say, Mr. Bailey touched on that. He justified the bank's actions to go big and go fast, as he described it, on that basis, that there was a real risk to the markets, that there was significant market volatility, that there was a need to take decisive action, and that would have been a very serious threat had it transpired. So all of this going on in the background of your decision making. Can we move then to really pick up the sort of systems and structures around that decision making, if we could? So moving on slightly in the list of topics, and I just want to pick up some sort of high level concepts really, and the first of those is that, I mean, generally speaking, do you agree that if it's possible, accepting pace, speed, the need for confidentiality in different times, accepting all of that, where possible, to bring together your delivery experts at the time of formulating policy is a good idea, particularly when responding to an emergency?
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't think it would be one you'd say no to. And so far as the Treasury was concerned, there was a very good example of that, I think, in terms of its relationship with His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and the policy partnership that we've heard a lot about, which is unique to those two departments, and probably because of how they're configured. Is that right?
Yes. Obviously, I'm trying to think of the exact legal link. I mean, HMRC is a body of HMT, and it has a minister that it's reports into, but obviously it's operationally independent, and essentially is the delivery mechanism for the most part of most of what the Treasury does. So there is an existing relationship between those two departments.
Yeah. And that meant, for example, when you were looking to stand up the CJRS, you could have the delivery experts in the room at the same time as you're formulating the policy, and that made it all deliverable quickly.
It was it would have been impossible without. I'd go as far as saying that. There was an extraordinary team at MHMRC, who I won't embarrass by naming them all. But we had that from the beginning. I think the PermSec at HMRC has described it as a shared vision and a single team approach, and which I really felt that it was. And it's normally not everyone's favourite government agency, HMRC, but I can honestly say in this period, we were all lucky as a country that they were able to deliver something as effectively as they did. Which, let's be candid, I think most people thought that it wouldn't work. In fact, certainly at least more than one journalist told me afterwards they were all ready to write the stories about how the whole system would fall over when it went live. I certainly had a very stressful morning.